Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the podcast, Simple Enlightenment. I'm Dean Graves, your host. We come to you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. In the previous episode, we described how the Creator prepared itself for the beginning of creation. The Creator projected itself as a combination of two concepts, infinity and intelligence, to create the environment of intelligent infinity, and then projected within this environment the concept of free will, also known as the perception of separation. Projecting the distortion of free will into intelligent infinity created consciousness, which is the vehicle for creation. Consciousness is the Creator as the subject that began to have interactions with the Creator as the object, and perceived its participation in those interactions to be as an independent being, establishing the first subject-object relationship. The initial subject-object relationship was replicated a numerically infinite number of times, so that there existed an infinite number of co-creators, or subjects, to the Creator's object, and an infinite number of creations. The proliferation of co-creators prompted the co-creators to regulate themselves by agreeing to adhere to the law of confusion. The law of confusion, also known as the law of free will, is always subordinate to the law of one, and is an agreement among the subject patterns of consciousness to not interfere with each other's creation endeavors. Therefore, each creator as the subject is able to develop a creation experience without influence from other patterns of consciousness, which is important to provide the uniqueness and diversity desired to fulfill the foundational purpose of creation. The law of confusion is a real-life doctrine which shares similarities with the prime directive used to guide the explorations of the fictional Star Trek television series. While the law of confusion is subordinate to the law of one, it is still a foundational condition for all experience within the particular creation that we share, and we presume it to be equally as foundational in all other creations. However, the law of confusion can be violated, whereas the law of one, by its very nature, cannot. The law of confusion is primarily violated by we who participate in the lower ranges of consciousness every time we choose to inhibit another person's free will. In interactions between higher and lower consciousness beings, such as ourselves, it is the intent that it will be absolutely upheld. The more elevated the consciousness, the lower the potential for a violation of the law of free will. Every pattern of consciousness participating in creation as a higher consciousness knows that it is the Creator according to the law of one, but also enigmatically perceives of itself as separate, according to its degree of free will intoxication. Every pattern of a higher consciousness being knows every other pattern of consciousness, no matter the degree of free will intoxication, as another part of itself, and because of its awareness of itself as the Creator, works in absolute harmony with every other pattern of consciousness without rivalry, competition, or contest. The mutual agreement of all patterns of consciousness to honor the absolute nature of free will by honoring the law of confusion and allow each other to explore the Creator without interference is also incorporated into and made a basic tenet of every aspect of creation. At the Creator Being levels of consciousness, nothing is hidden. Everything is known or available to be known by every aspect or fractal of the Creator. If one pattern of consciousness has an ideal, all the other patterns of consciousness immediately have access to that idea. Secrecy is an abomination in practice, and impossible when you know that all is one. Also, there is absolutely no need for duplication, which means that there are no duplicated parallel universes or any other similar theoretical creation structures, such as those woven into many earthly theories of existence. There is a commonality of experience, but no duplication, and it is only our naive perceptions of creation that lead us to promote the possibility of a duplicate. As we stated in previous episodes, creation is only possible because of the distortion of consciousness. Consciousness itself results from the distortion of intelligent infinity, the conceptual creator, by free will, which facilitates behavioral independence. In the series of compounding distortions within the creation that we experience, the next foundational distortion is energy. Infinite energy is created by the creator as the subject, the least free will intoxicated consciousness, acting upon love. When we say acting upon, we mean projecting the thought of infinite energy into the archetypical characteristic of love, because any action is only a thought that distorts some aspect of the Creator's projection of itself as a concept. All that we experience is a distortion of the archetypical concept of love, but love is not limited to the compassionate bonding emotion that humans usually think of when they announce a love for another. Love is an inherent characteristic of the Creator, which incorporates infinite capabilities and allows every experience we have to be the opportunity to explore the self, no matter whether it appears to us to be a positive or negative experience. We shall spend the better part of a future episode talking about love, but for now, understand that free will acting upon love to create infinite energy is the next distortion within the creation that we experience. Intelligent infinity is the clay from which all creations are made, including the singular creation that we experience. Within the creation that we experience, the creation of infinite energy by the Creator as the subject establish the foundation for all further developments of this particular creation. You should understand that the phrases identifying consciousness and the Creator as the subject are interchangeable because there is absolutely no difference between what these two phrases are identifying. Consciousness begins as an undiminished fractal of the Creator as the object, and when the distortion of manyness proliferated an infinite number of creations, there was no benefit in duplicating experience in any other creation. In order to accomplish the basic purpose of creation, consciousness decided to explore itself by establishing a scheme of diminishing fractals of itself, which is the same basic design prolific in all other creations. This is accomplished by consciousness projecting increasing degrees of free will into itself, creating an infinite number of stratified layers of consciousness. Since free will has the effect of being an intoxicant, each diminishing fractal of consciousness is drunker on free will than the layer above. Free will, being the perception of separation from the Creator, meant that each new fractal would perceive of itself a little more independent of the Creator and serve as a new subject to the preceding layer's object. The process of investing greater free will to create ranges of consciousness replicated the original subject-object relationship created when the Creator as the object created the Creator as the subject. As this process continued, the clarity of the subject-object roles of the more free will intoxicated consciousness became less apparent to the participating lower consciousness, but still remains obvious to these observing higher consciousness beings. Every fractal of consciousness created by increasing free will created new patterns of consciousness that became unique because it was able to interact with the other aspects of creation and interpret those experiences from its independent perspective. The initial creator as the subject grouped fractalized layers into a system of 8 ranges of consciousness, with itself as the undiminished top layer or 8th range of consciousness. Within creation, the 8th range of consciousness is still functioning as the undiminished fractal of the creator as the object, but the other 7 lower ranges are intoxicated to a greater degree and functioning with an increasingly dependent perspective of themselves and increasingly diminished capabilities. For example, the 7th range of intoxicated consciousness would hold a greater perception of its independence and diminished capabilities than the 8th undiminished layer. The 6th range would hold a greater perception of its own independence and diminished capabilities than the 7th layer, and etc. Each grouping constitutes a range of consciousness called a density. For our purposes, the term may be simply expressed as a range of consciousness distinguished by the quantity of free will and diminished creator capabilities available in its experiences. The 7th density is a fractal of the 8th density. The 6th density is a fractal of the 7th density, and etc. The entire system is still consciousness that is simply distorted in varying degrees by the concept of free will. Each diminished layer is still ultimately the creator as the object and is still the one infinite creator experiencing itself. At no point is an aspect of consciousness actually functioning independently other than its own perceptions of independence from the one infinite creator. All densities, other than the 8th, are further divided into incremental layers called dimensions. If a density is a mile, then a dimension is an inch. As we have experiences and explore the self, the intent of the design is that we will incrementally surrender our perception of separation, dimension by dimension, thereby allowing ourselves to become more multidimensional and increase our consciousness by surrendering our free will intoxication. This is the process of evolution and the process of becoming enlightened. Because everything begins as the creator as the object, and through the distortion of perceptions we become the creator as the subject, which includes you and me, we have nothing to gain along this process of evolution. However, as the Buddha taught, we have lots of stuff or distortions to get rid of. Becoming enlightened is the process of surrendering our perceptions of separation from the one infinite creator, which allows us to relearn of who we really are from the perspective of the unique personality created as a result of our experiences. We have experiences in all dimensions, in all densities of consciousness. Just as the first creator as the subject became a pattern of consciousness unique to the creator as the object, we have become and are continuing to develop a unique pattern of consciousness that we are creating as a result of how we interpret experiences. Some very interesting things happened at the 7th density level of consciousness. Prior to the concept of manyness being extended to 7th density, one of the most interesting things emerging was that certain characteristics of the one infinite creator became delineated. These characteristics are an inherent part of the creator, but were, prior to the seventh density delineation, indistinguishable from the whole. Because these characteristics are inherent to the one infinite creator, they are simply referred to as the inherent characteristics. There are 5 inherent characteristics which gave rise to the foundation for the balance of creation that we experience. These characteristics are awareness, love, wisdom, unity, and stillness. Repeating the subject-object relationship design, each of these 5 characteristics became a pattern of consciousness with their own identity within seventh density, and perceived of themselves as separate from each other, as well as the other patterns of consciousness established as seventh and eighth density. Awareness had its own identity, became its own pattern of consciousness, and, just like other patterns of consciousness, began to have independent experiences. Love, wisdom, unity, and stillness began an equivalent enterprise of having experiences and developing their own personalities too, but the patterns of consciousness of seventh density were not devoid of the other inherent characteristics. For example, awareness was predominantly awareness, but it was also love, wisdom, unity, and stillness. Love is predominantly love, but it is also awareness, wisdom, unity, and stillness, because even though it perceived of itself as a separate pattern of consciousness, it was still ultimately the one infinite creator experiencing itself. Each of the inherent characteristics has an identity and a name which further enhance their distinction from each other. Awareness is known as Sa, spelled S-A. Love is known as Ra, spelled R-A. Wisdom is known as Law, spelled L-A. Unity is known as Ya, spelled Y-A. And stillness is known as Ka, spelled K-A. Free will, the first distortion that began creation, also has its own identity and became known as Melchizedek. The 5 inherent characteristics and free will are archetypes of the Creator at a seventh density level of consciousness. In addition to the delineation of the inherent characteristics, 8th density Melchizedek created 7th density Melchizedek, which is a 7th density fractal of itself that perceives of itself as a separate identity or pattern of consciousness from the 8th density Melchizedek. Therefore, there is both an 8th density Melchizedek and a 7th density Melchizedek. They were able to simultaneously exist as both separate and in unity as one because of the increased free will intoxication and resulting distorted perception of 7th density Melchizedek. 7th density Melchizedek is able to act or think independently from 8th density Melchizedek because of this perception. The source, creator as the object, interacts with the identity known as 8th density and knows that there really isn't any separation between itself and 8th density. It irrefutably is aware that all is one, and that Melchizedek is a distortion of itself that perceived itself as separate. Likewise, when the 8th density identity Melchizedek interacts with its creation of the 7th density identity known as 7th density Melchizedek, it is aware that it is really just a part of itself. And when 7th density Melchizedek interacts with the 5 inherent characteristics, Ra, Sa, La, Ya, and Ka, it too is aware that it was really only interacting with itself. Creation at the 7th density level consists of 7th density Melchizedek, Sa, La, Ra, Ya, and Ka, which are all independent functioning patterns of consciousness that perceived of themselves as independent from each other. Just as one inherent characteristic pattern of consciousness was not exclusive of the other four, Melchizedek was also part of each of the five inherent characteristics, retaining the same desire to know itself by experiencing itself. Each of the five inherent characteristics began to further develop creation. Eighth density Melchizedek is both its own environment and its own pattern of consciousness. Likewise, seventh density Melchizedek is both its own environment and its own pattern of consciousness. The condition of serving as both its own environment and independent identity is also true of each of the inherent characteristics. For example, in seventh density, Ra is both an environment and an independent pattern of consciousness, as is each of the other four inherent characteristics. Because each inherent characteristic is an independent pattern of consciousness, but inclusive of the other inherent characteristics plus free will, they function with a bias towards their own characteristic. This bias began the behavioral characteristic called a racial mind. Ra, or love, has the racial mind predisposed towards the characteristics of love. Sa had the racial mind of awareness, and the other inherent characteristics function similarly according to their own bias. Each of the five inherent characteristics projected into their independent environment an infinite number of pods of consciousness that were also biased towards their inherent characteristic and functioning within the seventh density range of consciousness. Within each pod, consciousness is further fractalized by the addition of more free will to create the range of consciousness that comprises sixth density. Once sixth density is created within the pod, the concept of manyness is again applied, which created an infinite number of sixth density beings, each with its own identity biased towards their own characteristic, but in harmony with all of the other sixth density identities of their own sourced inherent characteristic and those of the other four archetypes plus Melchizedek. The creation of sixth density facilitated significantly expanded possibilities in the diversification and implementation of the creation design. Consciousness's awareness of unity with the one infinite creator below sixth density is able to be made variable in a way that is not possible with the relatively minimal levels of free will intoxication found in the seventh and eighth densities. Sixth density consisted of an infinite number of patterns of consciousness that initially obtained its uniqueness from the interactions with itself and higher consciousness, but the desire was to create a system that would also incorporate experience from the interactions with lower levels of consciousness below sixth density. Sixth density became a transitional density that separated the nature of the higher densities from those of the lower densities. Relatively speaking, sixth density is designed to be a more experientially hands-on or day-to-day manager density of the lower consciousness densities, while creating its own environment and still retaining its capabilities as a creator being. While seventh and eighth density is always aware of the most minute experiences of the lower five densities, it is sixth density that gets the call to create and manage consciousness experiences in the lower five densities. To accommodate this design, sixth density simultaneously created the lower five ranges of consciousness by adding several new distortions to the established practice of simply increasing free will intoxication. Instead of simply investing a bulk amount of consciousness to create a more intoxicated range of consciousness, and relying upon the increased intoxication alone to provide diversity of behavior, individual sixth-density patterns of consciousness invested into its own environment a stream of consciousness that would vertically span the full range of free will intoxication from first through fifth density. A single stream of consciousness is called a soul stream and allows consciousness in a soul stream to cumulatively amass experience from its seeming journey through the lower densities, while experiencing uniqueness on a dimensional level. In other words, the creator of soul streams allows the creator to know itself even more intimately by experientially exploring itself in the most incremental way. Within a single soul stream, the consciousness of fifth density is a fractal of sixth density. Fourth density is a fractal of fifth density, and etc. But all originate from an individual aspect of the source sixth density entity. The originating sixth density entity is called the higher self and maintains the roles of intermediate creator and coach to all levels of the soul stream, while any part remains in the lower five densities. This design also allowed for the implementation of the process we know as evolution, also known as the Enlightenment process. Initially, some consciousness was invested as fifth density, some at fourth density, and etc. But when the switch was turned on and the mechanism of creation was put into motion, the effectiveness of a soul stream became greatly magnified. Inherent to every aspect of consciousness was a programmed desire to return to its source. This meant that first density desired to return to source, but in order to do so, it had to evolve through second density and then third density, etc. And the pattern of consciousness uniquely matured as a result of its cumulative experiences in each density. This greatly enhanced the uniqueness of the patterns of consciousness evolving through the creation and greatly enhanced the infinite number of opportunities for the Creator to know itself by experiencing itself. Initially, when the system was first switched on, experience was only possible in a limited fashion because inexperienced aspects of, for example, fifth density aspects were interacting with other inexperienced fifth density aspects. But as the process operated and consciousness evolved upward from lower densities to higher densities, the evolved consciousness brought with it the cumulative experience from the lower densities. Consciousness graduates from density to density by surrendering free will intoxication as it explores itself. In other words, as consciousness incrementally learns who it really is, it increases its consciousness level. When consciousness surrenders free will intoxication, it knows itself to be the creator to a greater degree, hence it becomes more enlightened. In densities 1 through 5, consciousness is the same consciousness that populates 8th density. But because of significant free will and other distortions, it doesn't appear to us to be the same at all. Below 6th density, 2 other distortions are coupled with increased free will intoxication to enhance the uniqueness of experience. Below 6th density, the characteristic of intelligence and the nature of energy become altered and variable. There is significant additional information necessary to explain how and why these 2 distortions are used and why they are so effective in expanding uniqueness, so we will defer to future episodes for these explanations. The densities are grouped according to consciousness's abilities and subsequent service that it can provide to the whole experience of creation. 6th, 7th, and 8th densities are considered Creator Being Densities because they are primarily responsible for creation's design, implementation, and operation. Densities 1 and 2 are considered foundational densities, and densities 3, 4, and 5 are the experiential densities. Each descending density is a fractal of the one above, but each provides an important step in the process of the Creator knowing itself by experiencing itself. Each of the 5 inherent characteristics and Melchizedek is an archetype of the Creator in both 6th and 7th density. But in order to expand creation more significantly, more distortions of these archetypical inherent characteristics were created in 6th density. The 5 inherent characteristics of 6th density were acted upon by 6th density Melchizedek to create 26 additional 6th density archetypical distortions, which are not sustainable above 6th density because they are not inherent to the Creator. In other words, they don't exist above 6th density. The infinite consciousness of 6th density became infinitely diverse because every lower consciousness environment, the 1st through 5th densities, mixes and matches some or all of the 32 archetypes, 5 inherent characteristics, free will, and 26 distortions to facilitate unique experiences in the lower densities. The particular environment/experience we enjoy is comprised of only 9 of these archetypes and includes the 5 inherent characteristics, Melchizedek, which is free will, and 3 of the 26 distortion archetypes. At the level of consciousness that we all share, we don't know what we don't experience, so it has not yet been possible for me to know what the other distortion archetypes are that we don't experience. One of the 3 distortions that we do experience is the distortion of separation, which is a name just like the inherent characteristics. The archetype separation is called Ta, spelled Ta, which functions with a 6th density identity, the same as the 5 inherent characteristic identities. Ta has the same creative abilities as the 6th density inherent characteristic archetypes, even though it is a distortion archetype. Another distortion archetype included in our environmental design is Da, spelled Da, which is the distortion of movement or motion. Consciousness participating in other parts of our creation experience that do not include Da as one of its archetypes can't experience motion as we do, or at all, because it is not part of the design of the conceptual experience. Melchizedek is also a 6th density archetype in our environment and is part of every other creation experience as well because it is the distortion that begins creation. Melchizedek automatically gets invited to every party. Melchizedek doesn't create lower density experiences, but it is an integral part of every aspect of every experience regardless of the level of consciousness. The final archetype of our octave is a distortion of a distortion. In other words, it is a second-tier archetype, a 6th density consciousness, an accelerator to enlightenment, particularly in 3rd density, and has been instrumental in magnifying and enhancing opportunities for the Creator to know itself by experiencing itself. It is the distortion of unconsciousness, and is instrumental to the lower ranges of the 3rd density, but it loses its effect about midway through the density. The characteristic of unconsciousness is called Lucifer, which means light bearer or light bringer. Lucifer is a name you may be familiar with from various religious contexts and has consequently been given a negative image, but it is through the characteristics of unconsciousness that we are motivated to awaken from darkness and begin to see the light of truth. Lucifer is an archetype of the Creator instead of a devil, and serves to intensify the experience of what we don't like, so that we will be motivated to begin to be aware of what we do like at an accelerated rate. Invariably, truth is what we like, and what allows us to surrender our perception of separation, become increasingly enlightened, and align in unity with the Creator. The distortion of Da, which is movement, comes into existence because of Melchizedek acting upon the inherent characteristic of Ka. The archetype Ka is stillness, and the thought is one of polarity, which of course is movement. Movement is also change, and without movement we couldn't experience change. Our entire experience of creation is predicated upon change, which is often frightening when we don't have truth available to us. As we become more enlightened by increasing our dimensionality, we slow down and eventually directly experience stillness without the distortion of movement. The one infinite Creator is absolute stability and absolute stillness. The distortion of Ta, which is separation, exacerbates the foundational perception of separation that free will provides, so that we perceive ourselves as individual units of consciousness, and at our level of consciousness, cocooned within a physical body, separate from all other beings. The distortion of Ta is created by the archetype Melchizedek acting upon the inherent characteristic of Ya, or unity, by the creation of the polar opposite perception of unity. Evolution is the process of surrendering separation in favor of unity or oneness. The Enlightenment process begins in a state described as primordial darkness, which doesn't mean that it begins locked in a dark closet, but rather that consciousness begins the process as a clean slate, with no light, so that it is in total innocence. Remember that light is information. Consciousness has experiences, and as those experiences are uniquely interpreted with emotion from a perspective of separation, allows it to co-create creation by developing a unique pattern of consciousness, which is a self. Consciousness, as we experience it, begins with the perspective of separation, Ta, in a condition of constant movement, Da, and unconsciousness, Lucifer. But as we become awareness, Sa, we surrender our preoccupation and attachment to the authenticity of the distortions and choose to experience more of the inherent characteristics, or truth. Melchizedek, free will, is always our standard, allowing us to freely choose how we interpret experiences and consequently choose what we do like in preference to what we don't like. By doing this, in our density, we are learning to become awareness and begin to see and accept truth. Once we become awareness, we surrender the effects of Lucifer's unconsciousness and, for the first time, begin to learn of the infinite love that is always present in infinite energy. This is the process of enlightenment. We are all in the process, whether we are aware of it yet or not, and we will eventually be totally enlightened when we finally surrender all distortions and reunite with the oneness of the Creator. This is the law of one. The only question is how long we will choose to remain under the influence of the distortions and continue in chaos by vacillating between truth and darkness. How long will you remain within the confines of darkness before you finally begin to realize who you really are, liberate your awareness, and return to unity with all that is? Be aware that all that we have discussed so far is still without any of the physical aspects of creation. There are no universes, galaxies, solar systems, and no planets. Just as the Creator projected itself as the concept of intelligent infinity, everything that comprises creation is conceptual. Understanding the foundational concepts is essential to a better understanding of who you are and learning of truth. We will continue to lay the foundation for the appearance of the physical aspects of creation in the next episode, and discuss the process of enlightenment in greater detail in future episodes, while continuing to provide significant intervening information. Stay with us because it's an exciting journey. Exploring yourself is your purpose for being alive. Thank you for listening. If you are enjoying Simple Enlightenment and would like to see us continue to offer more information, we encourage you to help us by financially supporting what we are doing. The actual recording is only a small part of the effort to bring you this information, most of which takes money. Please enable us to continue this series and improve the product that we deliver to you by going to podcastenlightenment.org to make a contribution. There you will find free downloads of transcripts of every episode, additional information, suggested readings, and more, all free, of course. Every contribution helps, and as always, thank you for wanting to make the world a better place.